Stanford University.
Welcome to State of the Union 2014. My name is Rob Reich. I'm a professor in the Political Science Department. I also direct the undergraduate program in Ethics and Society, and I'm one of 3 faculty co-directors of the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, and I'm one of the 3 faculty members coordinating and hosting this class in the State of the Union. We're very excited about this class. I'll be teaching the class along with Jim Steyer, who's the CEO of Common Sense Media, and also a lecturer here in the Comparative Studies and Race and Ethnicity program. And our 3rd faculty member, unfortunately, is traveling in China tonight, but he'll be with us for the entire rest of the class. That's David Kennedy. He's an emeritus professor in the history department and a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. We have a really great agenda for you for the next 7 weeks of the class, 7 sessions with no class session on actual election night. The aim is to inquire into the health of American democracy, to ask questions about the State of the Union, where we'll look at some different topics along the way with different guests that we've assembled to help us discuss these issues. And tonight's conversation loosely will be coordinated around the midterm elections, although, of course, we'll have an expansive view about the issues that might play a role in determining the outcome of the midterm elections coming up in November. I want to mention one other, we think, interesting feature of this class and call it to your attention, perhaps as a way to signal something to you about what you might do to facilitate something that we hope will come to pass. When faculty at Stanford teach classes on political questions, the students who take the classes, of course, have a wide range of interests, a wide range of backgrounds, but they do tend to share one thing in common. They're somewhere between the ages of 18 and 22 years old. That's fine, but talking about political questions across a much larger age span is, of course, an essential part of a well-functioning democracy. And this is one of the few opportunities where people from the age of 18 to the age of whatever are in the same class together talking about common topics of interest. So we wish to encourage cross-generational conversation amongst you that will perhaps only infrequently happen here in class, because the conversation here will be on the stage, but there will be multiple efforts that we will make to facilitate ways for you to engage each other, not merely when you're walking in and walking out, but also online. Mentioning online education, a much, much bigger issue now than it was 2 years ago, the last time Jim and I taught a course called Election 2012. We are going to go, boldly into the technological future with this class the best we can. There is, like last time, an iTunes U version of the class, so that if you have friends, whether they're here or not, who wish to follow the class, roughly speaking, 48 or 72 hours after each class session, the video from the class will be available for free download on the Stanford iTunes U page. There will be similar videos available at the Stanford YouTube channel. And there will be multiple online discussion fora for you to take advantage of. And those discussion fora are where I hope the cross-generational conversation can happen. One other further note that's relevant there, you may notice that there are no microphones in the audience, which means there will not be opportunities for audience questions to the people on the stage. That's for 2 reasons. First, because we're videotaping the conversations and then posting them online, we would have to obtain consent from every one of you, or at least anyone who asked a question. That's impractical, and therefore, logistically, it's a challenge in order to incorporate that. But more importantly, we are interested in multiple forms of conversation, not just one-on-one questions to the panel, and we hope that the online forum will provide a venue for you to ask those questions. There will be ample opportunity for you, if you're someone in the audience who really wants a particular question to be posed to a forthcoming panel or panelist, please post your question online, and there will be opportunities for you to communicate to us, the instructors and coordinators, the things that are really burning in your mind to pose on stage, and we'll be happy to try to do that as often as possible. Finally, one other technological innovation. We're going to be using a bunch of different platforms, the platform medium.com, which has a page devoted to the material for this class. The suggested readings will be organized on a site called readlists.com. And we have a Twitter handle. And if you wish, because this is the thing that happens these days, many of you have devices right now, you wanted to tweet while the class is going on, you can use the hashtag Stanford, SOTU, State of the Union, Stanford, capital S, capital O, capital T, capital U. I think that exhausts all of the logistical things I want to mention, so I'm going to turn the floor over to Jim for introductions of our guests.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rob. And welcome, everybody. Great to be here. And thank you guys for coming. As my microphone, I guess I'll put in my pocket. I just had a couple of things on the technological side that are going to be fun. As Rob said, technology, thanks to many Stanford students and graduates, moves forward incredibly rapidly. You are going to be able to see tonight, after tonight's class, a feature that is going to be, you'll hear tonight here, but we did beforehand, which is a 2-minute version of the State of the Union from each of our guests. And we're going to play with that format throughout the quarter. We hope everybody will have it posted by next week's class, and then we have some very interesting ideas about how it might involve the class. And if it's like last time's class, a lot of other people around the country in this. I mean, bottom line is we think, well, certainly, as Rob mentioned, I'm a consulting prof here, and my day job is working on kids in education at Common Sense Media. But the reason I teach here is to come up with solutions to change the world. And State of the Union is really about the state of the union in this country and what we're going to do to improve the state of the union. And I think over the next 7 or 8 weeks, we're going to have an extraordinary group of guests look at a range of issues in a very free-flowing way. And as Rob said, we're going to really welcome participation from the audience, although we can't take questions during the class. But we think this should be great discussion, great fun, great ideas, and fundamentally great suggestions about how we can improve the state of the union in this country. So tonight we have 4 pretty remarkable guests who all came in here because at the end of the day, despite their success in their various occupations, they care about broader education opportunities. So I'm going to introduce them, I think, one at a time and let them go first with their thing. And I'll start with my great friend Steve Schmidt over here on my right. So Steve Schmidt, who has actually been in this class a couple of times before. You all probably know him. He played Woody Harrelson in the movie. Anyway, no, Steve, as you all know, was and for many things, has been a senior advisor to President George W. Bush, where he worked with the great Mark McKinnon, who you're also going to hear from in a minute. Steve, by the way, he did put on his resume that he helped shepherd the nominations of Samuel Alito and Chief Justice John Roberts. I would not put that on my resume, Steve, but, and I will, you'll see, have my own views to make to the class. But he's an extraordinary leader. You guys know he ran the presidential campaign of Senator John McCain. He ran Arnold Schwarzenegger's campaign for governor, successful campaigns for governor. He's one of the preeminent political leaders in the country who's really outlined, I think, a smart course for Republicans going forward. He is a doting father, and finally, he is my personal hair consultant. So, Steve Schmidt, 2 minutes to tell us about the State of the Union.
Thank you, Jim. Well, it's great to be here. Great to be back in the class. Look, there's a lot of dysfunction in American politics today. We have a generation of political leaders that, as one of my colleagues up here said, really give voice to George Washington's admonition about the dangers of faction that he left the country with in his farewell address. And so when you look, though, at the strength of the country, I think it's much more than the sum of its politicians. And you travel around the world, you go to Europe, you go to Asia, the United States of America remains the most competitive place in the world to invest, to do business. We have tremendous strengths. We're a center of technology. We're a center of innovation. The shale gas revolution taking place, the natural gas reserves in this country where we will, in the next 10 years, be energy independent, where we will be a net energy exporter, which is good for the free countries of the world. It's bad for Vladimir Putin. It's bad for the Middle Eastern potentates. We will see, because of the decreasing cost of energy, manufacturing jobs that left this country coming back into the country. And we look at some of our fiscal problems, our tax problems, and we can't cut or tax our way out of any of these problems at 1.8, 1.9% economic growth. But at 3.2, 3.3% economic growth, none of them are particularly difficult to fix. So I think that people have a natural tendency to look at their own time and their own space that they occupy in their lives and have an exaggerated sense of how great things are going or how bad things are going. But if you look where the country is today, against the challenges of facing fascism in the early 1940s, the threat of communism over the 50s and 60s, the Great Depression, the horror of a civil war that was a bloodletting, really almost unprecedented as a percentage of the population in history, our problems are not so severe today as to not be able to be overcome, and they are certainly not so severe as some of the other challenges that the country has confronted and overcome in its history.
Okay. Thank you very much, Steve. So our next, and then we're going to have three more 2-minute shots and then complete free-flowing discussion. Next to Steve is our good friend Mark McKinnon, who has, for the past 3 decades, been, like Steve, one of the most important political strategists and communications strategists in the United States. He has a number of remarkable accomplishments. Probably the most remarkable accomplishment was with his good buddy Karl Rove, architecting the victory in 2000 of President George W. Bush. He had previously been campaign manager for Ann Richards in Texas, so he has a long history of Texas politics. And I do think the victory of George W. Bush in 2000, one of the most amazing political wins ever, if you think about what they had to overcome with someone running against them who had peace and prosperity to run on. Mark has also, however, gone on to do a tremendous amount of other important things. He's the co-founder of No Labels, which is an effort to remove some of the ridiculous partisanship from the current state of American politics. He also has been working with our former colleague here, Larry Lessig, who was a Stanford law professor now at Harvard, on the whole effort to reduce the influence, the very negative influence, in my opinion, of money in politics and the whole world that Citizens United had given us. And he's, like Steve, one of the premier political thinkers and leaders in our country. He is also a newly doting grandfather. So, Mark McKinnon.
Well, I'll clean this up, Jim, but in Texas we say, you're raining on my leg, but it's warm and it feels good. Think about it. I totally agree with Steve about American exceptionalism, and that gives us great hope and optimism to overcome what is really a disaster in American politics today. And the problem is that for a wide variety of reasons that we could spend a very interesting hour talking about, Washington has just ground to a halt due to hyperpartisanship, due to a media that feeds this beast. Just as I was on a show recently where I was talking about no labels and bipartisanship and bringing people together. We went to the commercial, and the host, who you all know, turned to me and said, "Can we just cut the bipartisan crap and give us some red meat?" So that's kind of how the media is playing this game. So one issue that I'm spending a lot of time on with Larry Lessig is money in politics, which I do think is at the root of almost all the problems that we face in Washington when you think about pay to play and issues that surface to the top because of the lobbying dollars that are spent and kids' issues which aren't recognized because they don't have lobbyists. But let me just give you a quick example. Citizens United was a Supreme Court decision a few years ago that has completely transformed the landscape of spending in this country. Corporations are recognized as people. But here's the practical outcome. Just as an example, recently in Georgia in a Senate race, there was a competitive Republican primary, and an incumbent congressman was running and comfortably ahead. A month out of the blue, undisclosed and anonymously, $2 million got dropped on his head from a super PAC, C4, that didn't have to disclose. And we still don't know where that money came from. So somebody bought a Senate seat in Georgia. That Republican's going to win now. And we have a situation where because of this dark, undisclosed, and PAC money that can now be spent in most Senate races, certainly the competitive ones. I'll just give you an example, Colorado, where I spend a lot of my time now. In the last Senate race, the outside money spent in that race was 6 times more than the actual campaign spent themselves. So we basically had the Chamber of Commerce on one side, the unions on another side, And it became a campaign between the unions and the Chamber of Commerce. It really wasn't between the candidates and the campaigns anymore. So that's a huge problem. But the good news is that we started this organization called No Labels because of the demand that we see outside of Washington for problem solving. People say, I don't care if it's a Democratic solution anymore, or a Republican solution, just some please some forward progress. In response to that, we've actually got 94 members of Congress, half Republicans, half Democrats, to sign up. They're meeting regularly. They've got more done in 3 months than the Congress has done in the last 2 years, including no budget, no pay, which solved the recent debt ceiling crisis. So it's incremental, but I'll tell you that there's the folks in Washington who are having to come back and talk to you, particularly the freshman legislators, the new people coming in, they're getting it, and things are heading at least incrementally back in the right direction, I think.
Thanks, Mark. Our next guest is Ruth Marcus, who's one of the most important and respected political columnists in the United States. Ruth works at the Washington Post. She focuses her columns now on politics, domestic policy. She's been working there for nearly 30 years. She has covered campaign finance, the Justice Department, the Supreme Court, the White House, et cetera. She was both a reporter and editor at the Post and has covered virtually everything that you can cover in American politics. Joined the editorial board and began writing her column in 2006. She went to that school in New Haven, somewhere back east, and the law school outside of Boston, but we still invited her to come and be part of the panel tonight. She's a great mom. She writes about all these guys, and I think has a lot to say about Washington, D.C., because she has lived in that town for many years and writes beautifully about the challenges we're facing there, but also some of the solutions. So, Ruth Marcus.
Finally, I made it to Stanford.
Woo!
Thank you. And I'm from New Jersey, so I don't have some great folksy saying to start with like Mark. I'm a little bit bummed. If we had a Jersey saying, it would probably be something about traffic, but
or bridges.
Or bridges. I was not going to really go there. I was trying to be nice to you guys, but all right. Even though you picked on the media before. I actually really want to start with something that Mark said, because I've written a lot about money in politics, and I wish that I could agree with him that that is at the root of all of our problems, because my view is going to be the really Debbie Downer view. Money in politics is a very big problem in American politics. Don't get me wrong. I totally agree with everything that you said. But even if we magically solved our system of money in politics, the State of the Union would still be dangerously frayed. And that's the thing that I'm going to do a little bit of downbeat, and then we're all just so desperate to end on an up note, I'm going to do a little up note at the end. I think there are some really serious structural problems that we need to deal with aside from money in politics. We have sorted ourselves out into not just red states and blue states, but red counties and blue counties, so that we are just, congressional dysfunction is so serious, and it's actually a kind of rational dysfunction, which is to say that if I'm from a safe Republican district or safe Democratic district, I don't have to worry about whether I'm going to be reelected in a general election. I have to worry about whether I'm going to face a primary challenge from my left or my right. So that the congressional intransigence you see isn't just because they're having fun arguing with the president or automatically sticking up for the president. It's because they're acting in their rational self-interest. I also think it's important to say that while I think Congress deserves all the scorn that has been heaped on it over the last umpty-ump years, I think it's fair to say that it's unfair for me to go before Joel, because then, or maybe it's wrong for me to go before Joel, because then he'll tell you why I'm wrong. But the president ran and was elected on the notion that he was going to be able to transcend red state and blue state politics. And we can have a discussion about why he's been unable to do that. But I think having been so poetical in the run-up in the election process, he's been just disappointingly prosaic in the execution of the capacity to bring us together. It obviously just hasn't happened. And I also think that we have to fess up as a public to our own role in this problem. I just was reading about a new poll from the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania, another one of those East Coast universities. Nonetheless, some of the figures are astonishing. It was issues about civic engagement. Something like half of Americans can't tell you which party controls the House or the Senate. How can we rely on electing politicians, electing decent politicians, when we've got an electorate that seems to be so uninformed? Some number of them couldn't name, a third of them could not name a single branch of government. I'm not talking about all 3 branches of government. I'm talking about just one. So that's the bad part. I think the good part is twofold. First, there are some tweaks that we could make to make our system work a little better. We could have because we've sorted ourselves out residentially so much, this wouldn't do very much, but it would help at the margins to have some nonpartisan redistricting in elections. I also really believe it would help to think about opening up our electoral system so that we had what you have here in California, top 2 vote-getter primaries, which really can help in these all red or all blue districts promote more moderate candidates. And I think we need to be, instead of worrying about voter fraud, which is really a fraud, we need to make voting easier for people, not harder. And finally, I would say that for all the scoring that's heaped on politicians, I live in Washington. I spend my days talking to politicians. I'm always struck not just about how the country is better than its institutions, but how the people in the institutions are really better than the institutions themselves. There are a lot of people there who didn't just run to be called Mr. Senator or Ms. Senator, but in order to get stuff done. And we just need to find a way to create a system that allows them to live up to their potential of getting something done.
Thank you, Ruth. Well, we have a lot to talk about, but before we do, last and certainly not least is our guest, Joel Benenson. So Joel, like Steve and Mark, has some extraordinary political victories to his credit. He's the founder and CEO of the Benenson Strategy Group. We've worked a lot together on stuff, just like I've worked with some of these other guys, on non-political issues. But Joel is also probably best known as President Obama's pollster. So talk about an amazing win in 2000. Joel joined the Obama team when no one knew President Obama would be elected twice as president. So he is still the President Obama's pollster and has helped craft the 2 extraordinary campaigns for president that Barack Obama ran. He's also, like Steve and Mark, Steve at Edelman and Mark in his various occupations, a consultant to Fortune 500 CEOs, to major companies on political strategy. He was named Pollster of the Year by the American Association of Political Consultants. That's pretty good. And
I don't know about that.
I don't know. And the truth is this. Barack Obama might not be the president of the United States if he didn't have Joel Benenson as his pollster. So take it away, Joel.
Thank you. That's as gracious an introduction as I could have expected from you, Jim. I appreciate every word of it. And I come from Queens, which is one of the boroughs in New York City. And it's, we view a day without an argument there as a lost opportunity. So I've got to jump at the chance to tell Ruth why she was wrong.
Surprise!
Not really, actually, but I do want to address the point she made. I don't think any of us could argue that President Obama transformed politics or fixed the broken politics we had in the way that he would have liked to. But I also think, and this is just going to be a pivot point to a larger discussion about some social dynamics that I think put us at a pretty fragile place right now. I know I'm the oldest one on this panel. I don't know that I'm the oldest one in this room. But I don't think any of us in our lifetime had a leader in Congress say that the most important thing they could achieve would be to make the president a one-term president. And that happened when Mitch McConnell said it in 2010. Now, I don't think that's all that's wrong, but I think it's reflective of a fundamental dynamic that is compromising our ability to get things done in America. I believe to a great extent, for a combination of reasons, our ability to compromise, some of the structural things Mark and Ruth both touched on, is almost non-existent today. We are not having a national conversation anymore. I grew up during a very turbulent time in the 60s and 70s, and everybody watched fairly neutral news for 30 minutes every night. Tonight, you're all consuming media that you want to, that you choose to, largely that you identify with, and people always did. And the media was often always partisan. We had newspapers called the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, the Arizona Republican. It was known what the partisan tilt was. But that common conversation often led to us talking to each other in the workplace and finding common ground and reaching the common good. Not only is that not happening in our communities to the extent we want, it is certainly not happening in our politics. And we have such a degree of demonization and playing to the crowd on whatever media outlet you can get on if you're a politician, that the American people never hear how we find that middle ground and how we get back in touch with our common good. I think there are social dynamics at work right now that are the residue from an economic crisis, and I'm very bullish about America, just like Steve is. I never use the term American exceptionalism. I don't think there is such a thing. I think what makes us exceptional is when we do things right, when we educate our children the way we need to do, not the way we're failing to do it today. I got to college because the City University, my mother was a single mother in the 1950s, raising 3 children, and the only reason I got to college was because the City University of New York was free tuition. I paid $57 a semester to get a college degree. Today, college is unaffordable to more and more children. And in this world, our American exceptionalism is not going to endure if we don't educate people for the tasks of the 21st century, and we are not doing that well enough right now. We can't agree on how to fund education. We're at a point where we are about to start spending more money on health care than we are on our children's education for the first time in our history. Our politics right now, coming out of the crisis, the economic mindset of Americans, and I can't speak for Palo Alto, but I know a lot about middle class and working class voters all around America. The American people went through a really apocalyptic event in 2008. The economic crisis was severe and profound, and most working Americans recalibrated their lives, recalibrated how they thought about their own economic place and their children's economic place. They became not risk averse, but they weigh risk very carefully. They've dialed down their spending. We paid down credit card debt for the first time in 50 years because people didn't want to be in debt. They hate debt. They are now saving money more than they have in 40 years because they'd rather pay cash. They put off a vacation. And it's not about denying themselves gratification. It's about this recalibration. The American dream that was part of my mother's generation that I heard about, I bet a lot of the folks, how many people under 30, how many of you had your parents talk to you about the American dream? Put your hands up. Hardly any hands. It's an experience that only relates to the greatest generation and their children or people who are one step removed from an immigrant experience. And the emblems of the American dream in this 21st century, a house, 2 cars in the driveway, a college education, for most working Americans, became the heaviest burdens that they had in their lives because of their mortgage debt, the cost of college tuition that's strapping kids when they get out of school and putting them with unprecedented debt, and the 2 cars just means 2 car loans and more interest I'm paying instead of supporting my family. And I think if our politicians don't get in touch with that quickly and get past where they are right now in Washington, and I think there are some remedies that folks are going to talk about tonight, and some of them have been mentioned already, I'm not as sanguine about our future. If we don't repair our democracy, we won't repair our country.
Wow. Okay. I told you we had a great panel. Rob, why don't you go first question, and then we're going to let you guys, you can ask each other questions. You can argue. You can say whatever you want.
Well, let's start with the thing that no other panel that will hold in this class will have as much expertise on as you guys do, which is making some predictions, going on record, as it were, about the outcome of the November midterm election. So why don't you tell us about what's going to happen in the Senate?
Isn't it amazing our obsession with predictions today? You know, you folks probably hear more about polling in a day than people used to hear in a whole election, right? And that's coming from a pollster. And I'm not saying that's a good thing, you know?
But I would just tell you, I saw Joel at the 2012 Democratic Convention, and he completely predicted accurately every state. This was in August, completely predicted the 2012 election. So let's hear what Joel has to say about 2014.
I don't remember predicting every state, but I was pretty close, I think. But look, I think that this is, somebody the other day said to me, so how's the Senate going to come out? And what are our chances of holding the Senate? The person was a Democrat. I said 50-50. Somebody else, oh, I could have said that. I said, no, I mean 50-50. I meant 50 seats Democrat and 50 seats Republican, which would probably, given Kansas, which I think actually would be probably the 50th seat, which is an odd dynamic right now on its own. But I think the Democrats have a reasonable chance. But again, the odds are not overwhelming. I really think it's a coin toss right now, and most of the forecasters would say it's a coin toss. But I think that we end up on election night waiting into Wednesday morning in the wee hours to see probably how Colorado turns out, to see whether we are at 50-50, which would give the Democrats a one-seat advantage. But one point on that, and I know you want to talk about the midterms, just to reflect back on the first point, Rob.
What if will it go beyond that because of Louisiana and the runoff?
You know, right now, I think...
He's got over 50% right now. Cassidy does.
Yeah, I think right now I would put Louisiana leaning Republican and looking at how the Democrats get from 45 to 50, including Kansas. But, you know, as a practical reality, and not to shift away from the midterms, it doesn't really matter. The Republicans have de facto control of the Senate for the last 6 years because of the filibuster, even though the Democrats have a majority. And that's one of the devices that is driving the power of factions and driving apart the impetus to compromise. And so, you know, we're going to struggle with that for a while.
Mark.
Just two quick points. One is you mentioned Kansas, and I'm not sure everybody understands what's going on in Kansas. I just want to mention because it's so interesting.
It's Stanford.
Well,
I went to Queens College.
there was a Republican and a Democrat running, Republican incumbent, and an independent got enough signatures on the ballot to run as an independent and showed so well and had his own money that the Democrats decided it would be better for the Democratic candidate to drop out of the race, therefore knowing the Democrats never going to win in Kansas, thereby giving a chance for the independent to win. And right now the independent's running ahead. And he's run, by the way, completely on a very no-labels message about the importance of bringing people together, bipartisan, working across the aisle. So for me, that's very encouraging to see that kind of candidacy do as well as it is. The question I wanted to ask back at you, Joel, is that, and for Steve or anybody else, you know, first of all, this is what we call an off-cycle election. It's not a presidential year. That's generally better for Republicans. It doesn't appear that it's going to be a huge wave election, but still naturally sort of a Republican. This is just a sort of election where more Republicans show up. I always look at whatever party is talking about the importance of turnout is the party that I think is in trouble. And once again, the Democrats are talking about the importance of turnout. My question to you, Joel, is in an off-cycle election, can you really dial up the turnout the way you need to in order to...
So there are two parts, just the premise of the question, which when I worked for Mario Cuomo, who was the first politician I ever worked for, said, always reject the premise of the question. And I had been a reporter covering him, right? And now I use that in media training with candidates, right? Like, don't take the premise of Ruth's question, right? But look, off-year elections are good for Republicans, except when it was 1986 and Ronald Reagan lost seats, when it was 2006 and George Bush lost seats. I think those things follow somewhat of a pattern. What people typically mean by that, Mark, I think, is that the electorate tends to skew older, and in this day and age, that skews a little bit more Republican. I think Democrats talk turnout now in every election. I'm working in your home state of Texas now. Well, it's not your native state, but it's where you worked a lot, right? I learned today. Where, you know, there are 2 million voters. There are some people who say Texas isn't a red state, it's a non-voting state. There are 2 million eligible Hispanic voters in the state of Texas who haven't been registered yet. There are 1.2 million people who voted for Barack Obama in 2012 who didn't vote for Bill White in 2010. I think in 2008, a lot of people in 7 talked about the Obama apparatus and said, oh, they always talk about turnout, always talk about grassroots organizing. You know, the technology is changing in a way. The sophistication of the voter list is changing in a way. I think in the states that we're competitive in, Mark, I think turnout is going to be a factor. I think a state like North Carolina, where Kay Hagan is a Democrat running in a year where the election should favor a Republican. Romney, I think, only carried it by 2 points. She's now ahead also by 5 or 6 points. And I thought from the outset of the cycle we needed one surprise win in either Georgia or North Carolina. I think she's going to get it in part because of changing demographics, because of the Democrats' ability to turn out the vote, because we've played hard there in 2 presidential elections. I think it's a sign of weakness if you think that's all you're doing. I think candidates and campaigns matter. Turnout is going to be part of that. And there are going to be some places like North Carolina where we're going to have to do it to win that seat.
So
Go ahead, Ruth.
I'd like to say something about the does it matter question, because the kind of pseudo-sophisticated, cynical, world-weary attitude answer towards this question is, well, of course not. Nothing will get done one way and nothing will get done the other way. So why are we all worked up about it? And actually, the president was asked about the importance of the election in an interview a few weeks ago, and he kind of had a hard time framing what the practical importance was. And I wanted to throw out a kind of provocative suggestion and get the reaction of my friends here, which is there seems to me to be a reasonable argument that having a Republican Senate, and I kind of gulp to say this because there are reasons that have to do with nominations and particularly the prospect of a Supreme Court vacancy that make me really not want to see a Republican-controlled Senate. But I think there is a reasonable argument that having a Republican-controlled Senate could open the door to more progress in Washington. That's a pretty low bar than we've seen so far. And here's the argument. First of all, Republicans in the Senate will understand that their majority is a very tenuous majority, not just in the number that it might be, whether it's 51 or 52, but also in the time frame that they will have it, because the atmosphere and the set of battlegrounds in 2016, the number of Republican seats is almost the reverse. So you come in saying, whoa, we might just have 2 years here. That means a couple things. We might just have 2 years here. First of all, we got to prove to those folks who elected us that we can get something done, not just stop things. Number two, well, we're not going to have Obama to kick around for that much longer. First of all, sorry, Joel, to keep doing this to you, he has not proved himself the best negotiator. If I were Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, I might prefer to do my negotiations with President Obama than with, say, President Hillary Clinton. And also, I'm going to want to show my bona fides, and it may be my only opportunity to do it. Finally, having a Republican Senate, and really, every time I say this, I just gulp that I'm making this argument, might have a chastening effect on the House. Now, you know, the Senate will send something over to the House, and they say, well, thanks, but not paying any attention to it, and vice versa, by the way. But there is at least more possibility for putting pressure on the Senate on the House, sorry, with a Republican Senate than with a Democratic Senate. And you still have, and this is how I could sleep soundly at night, the prospect of presidential veto to keep us safe from the worst of what a Republican Senate and Republican House might do together. So that's my provocative argument for the night.
Okay, so I think we should go to Steve, because you will all be able to watch Steve, maybe one or two other of these guys, on election night, telling us what happened. Steve, what will happen on election night? This is on videotape. We will show it the week after on the 11th. So what, Steve, what will happen?
I think Republicans are going to do really well in the Senate. I think we'll take control of the Senate. We'll be at 52 seats. I do, my prediction is I think that we talk about a wave election. I don't necessarily believe that there's going to be a wave election across the country, because I believe Republicans are going to lose a couple governors in close races. But I do think in these Senate races, the Senate races are going to break in the Republican direction. I think at the end of the day, you know, there's two types of elections. There's change elections and there's more of the same elections. And when it comes to Washington, you look at the unpopularity of the institution, and you look then at what's happening in the world right now. And we should talk about, you know, some of this tonight. You know, there's a growing chaos in the world. If you look at what's happening in the Middle East, you look at what's happening in Ukraine. You look at the rise of nationalism, Vietnam, China, Japan, the disputed Thailands and territories there. We're looking at a situation in Africa where there could be 1 million Ebola cases by the end of January, with a profound threat to spreading outside of Africa into Europe, into the United States, in an interconnected world with airplanes. And so there's no pathway, as I look at the events in the world over the next month or so before the election, right, for there to be a calming. I think that there's going to be increasing chaos, increasing anxiety, increasing worry. And you just look at the natural terrain where these races are taking place, just geographically, it's favorable to the Republican candidates, broadly speaking. But look, one of the lessons for Republicans should not be winning an election, taking control of the Senate in 2014, because we have very, very deep structural problems in terms of our capacity to be competitive in a presidential election.
Can I jump in there, because when Joel mentioned the situation in Texas with the number of folks who are not yet registered, aren't participating in the election, and the more optimistic view you just gave, Steve, about the prospects for Republicans in this election, I want to put immigration on the table, and in particular the number of Hispanic and Latino folks in the country and what that implies for the future of the GOP. And so you were here 2 years ago, 10 days after the election in 2012, and I want to play a clip of what you said 2 years ago. This is Steve Schmidt 2 years ago.
And that is a sentiment that Republicans would be well served to remember. When you think about Hispanics, if you were to play a word association game with members of Congress in the Republican Party, and you were to say, for example, Latino, the response would likely to be illegal immigrant or immigration, as opposed to perhaps Silver Star winner or fireman or teacher or doctor or lawyer. And indisputably, our country is richer for the contribution of our Hispanic American citizens. And the Republican Party had better figure out a way to reach out to this demographic, which, by the way, is entrepreneurial, is the #1 net contributor to military service in this country, are steeped in traditional values. And unless and until we do, and unless and until we stop allowing guys like Tom Tancredo and Steve King, the congressman from Iowa, to be our forward face to this community, we will continue to devolve from a once great national party to a regional Southern party that's based as Southern evangelical Christians, and that will be a great disservice to the country if that's allowed to happen. And let me also.
All right, so structural changes in the population, demographic changes. Yeah. That was 2 years ago. How's the GOP doing now?
Look, this is without exception, every demographic group in this country that's growing, Democratic Party's gaining market share. Without exception, every demographic group in this country that is shrinking, Republicans are gaining market share. Right? That's in the marketing business a big problem. If you look at just the states that the Democrats have won 6 out of the last 6 elections, they have 242 electoral votes with 270 needed to win. That doesn't count Florida, Ohio, Virginia, North Carolina, New Mexico, Nevada, Iowa, Ohio, New Hampshire. So it's very difficult to win a presidential election if you don't get about 40% of the Latino vote. Ronald Reagan used to get it. George W. Bush got it. John McCain was down to 32. Mitt Romney down to 27. And this is a math problem at the end of the day. There's 2 types of churches. There's the type of church that goes out and tries to get converts, and there's the type of church that's in the business of hunting heretics. And so when the Republican Party says, broadly speaking, to Latinos, that we don't want you in, we don't particularly, with a lot of our rhetoric, seem to like and care for you very much, it's very, very difficult to communicate a message on the economy or on other issues. And last point here, this immigration issue is a threshold issue. You can't even begin to have a conversation on education reform, on the economy, on economic growth, on a number of other issues until this issue is solved. And as Joel pointed out earlier, every first generation immigrant community in this country over the past 20th century has always started out in the Democratic Party. It's their children and grandchildren who, as they move up the economic ladder, have been more open to the conservative economic messages, have been more open to the Republican Party's message. And when Republicans say there's no way we can compete with the Latino vote, I don't understand how you can say that when we used to get 40% of the Latino vote as recently as 2004 in George W. Bush's race. And the other problem, which is underreported, but one of the second fastest growing population in the country is the Asian population. And we're tanking worse among Asians than we are in Hispanics. I was actually in a meeting where someone in the meeting said, why are we doing so bad with the Asians? We really haven't done anything to make them mad yet. And so we have big problems in this space.
You know, I want to follow. This is a great question. You know, for you guys who took the class, for people who were in the class in 2012, election 2012, you may remember, we're not doing it this year, we did a class on the Supreme Court, and we did it with Goodwin Liu, the Stanford grad who's now on the California Supreme Court, and Pam Carlin, our colleague at Stanford Law School, who Rob and I have taught with for years, who we love, who took a leave of absence from Stanford. She used to be a lawyer at the NACP Legal Defense Fund with me a number of years ago, to go back to the Justice Department to do voting rights cases. So I actually have a more practical question, which is, and I actually say it to the audience to think about, particularly the young people, which is, where are we in our country where we have voter suppression going? That someone said, I can't remember who said that the voter fraud thing is a total fraud, which you did, thank you, Ruth. Overcame the Yale background and made the good comment. But here's the thing. Where are we as a country where one of the parties is consciously engaged in the destruction of voter participation? And if you are a young person in the audience, why would you want to permit that to happen? And an older person as well, but particularly as a young person who's going to inherit this democracy. A country where where we are suppressing votes. And what is the solution on both sides of the aisle for that? Because it's insane.
Yeah, here's an irony. You know, all the Republicans who are screaming about voter fraud, almost 90% of them come from states that have been dominated by Republicans for the last 20 years. So it must be taking place in their states. I said this to somebody in Texas the other night. You guys have been in power for 20 years. If you're screaming about fraud, you've been winning for 20 years. Who's cheating? You know, but I think, and here's where Democrats miss the mark, I think. Look, if you ask African American and Latino voters if they think you should have a photo ID to vote, a majority of them say yes. Because they're the folks who are being kept in line for 5 hours to vote on a regular basis. Go look at the lines in Florida, right? They know that, hey, there may be a better way for me to be able to vote more easily. I think Democrats, this is a place where Democrats could get out in front of this, not do it tomorrow, but say, look, let's get to a national voter system using technology. We can get a draft card to everyone who turns 18. Let's get a voting card to everyone that they swipe. And, you know, you could put some kind of imprint on it and make the states upgrade their voting machines, and we should be for everybody voting. And I think we could get Republicans to go along with that, put a 10-year period on it. You know, our democracy is only going to be stronger if more people vote than less. One quick thing about the demographic piece. There's also a generational divide in this country on a lot of issues that are the dominant issues. Immigration, climate change, gay marriage. If you look at attitudes of people over 50 and under 50 on those issues, there's a palpable difference. It even creeps up to 60 on some of those issues now. And so for the structural advantages that Steve talked about, it's not just a Latino issue or an Asian issue, which is a growing population as well, by the way. But you know, the folks who are aging up here, who are now having a pretty big disconnect with the Republican Party, that portends badly for the party beyond just the, you know, Hispanic question. Steve was talking about immigration in 2012. Being on the wrong side of gay marriage today, millennials, I bet most of the millennials in this room, if someone's against gay marriage, you probably think of them or call them a bigot, which is how in the 60s we talked about people who were opposed to civil rights. And so Steve's right. When you make that kind of disconnect, you know, there's a narrow window for Republicans to bridge that. And I hope they do, because I think for the democracy we have to bridge it. I don't mean to, you know, take up too much time, but I just think it's beyond one demographic group right now.
Mark, you wanted to get in on this?
Well, Steve and I both work on this issue. I'm the co-chair of Texans for freedom to marry, for marriage equality. You know, I think it's ideologically inconsistent for Republicans who preach the gospel of more freedom, less government, and stronger families to oppose marriage equality. But to your point, I mean, I just think it's the right thing to do. I think it's the moral thing to do. I think it's the legal thing to do. But politically, to your point, I think it's, you know, Republicans on all these issues, which you rightly recognize as, you know, moving forward. And on this issue, I haven't seen a public policy issue move as quickly as marriage equality has in my entire political lifetime. And 60% of Republicans under 30 support marriage equality. So I'm with Kinky Friedman on this one, which is gay couples should have every right to be just as miserable as us married folks.
But, you know, you don't see Republican candidates running against Democratic candidates for supporting marriage equality. It's really interesting. But that has been bizarrely diffused as a wedge issue, surprisingly diffused as a wedge issue.
Yeah.
You do see Republican candidates running against Democrats on the issue of amnesty and immigration. And so, given the demographic imperatives for the party, softball question here, why does the party seem incapable of solving its own self-diagnosed problem?
Well, let me just give you a quick number, and then I'll go to that just to amplify its importance. George W. Bush had a message about compassionate conservatism and was talking about reforming issues that Republicans hadn't talked about before during the 90s on immigration and education, which attracted millions of Democrats and independents like me to become Republicans and to support George W. Bush. Because of his Hispanic-friendly policies and progressive views and the fact he'd been a border state governor, in 2000, I think we got 41% of the Hispanic vote. But what was interesting is a week after that, our pollster came in and said, you know, congratulations, we got 41% of the Hispanic vote, and as soon as the Supreme Court rules, we're going to be president. But,
how do you know that?
He can count. But he said that if we maintain this number, if we get 41% next time, we'll lose. We have to increase our vote share of Hispanics in 2004 to 43 because he recognized the growing tide. So we got 43% in 2004, and as Steve mentioned, Mitt Romney got 27. Well, we're not going to regain the presidency with those kind of numbers. And to your question, I mean, when you see, it's all about trying to win Republican primaries, which have just been dragged so far right. That part of the reason Rick Perry lost was he got attacked for giving dream status to immigrant kids
and
in
just
Texas.
Remind us who was attacking him for that?
Mitt Romney, yeah.
But let me ask you this, how does this then, if you talk about the demographic change, and as thoughtfully as you do, Steve, or as you do, Mark, how could there possibly be a Republican win in 2014? Is it simply
2014 or 16?
This time. Is it simply people aren't turning out to vote and you have a bizarre, you have a perfect storm of the races that are up? Because what you're suggesting is the trends, unless the Republican Party gets a lot more moderate and intelligent about appealing to Latino, Asian Americans, et cetera, or millennials. How does that happen just because there's such low turnout?
The turnout is very different.
States that are up also.
I'm sorry?
There are very few states up. Go ahead, Steve. I'm sorry. You can.
No, I was saying the turnout's very different in a midterm election.
Right.
It's, as Joel was about to say, it's the states that'll be up. It's different than it's different than a national election. Look, one of the beginning really with Richard Nixon's Southern strategy in 1968 in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, historically, the Republican Party is founded in 1854. And by 1858, it's the majority party in the North and the West. It's a Northern and Western party by its heritage and its history. And beginning in 1968 and over the next generation, the Republican Party has become the Southern Party. The Southern Party never has and never will win presidential elections in the United States. It can be and has been a majority congressional party. And that's where, the Republican Party sits today. And so the Republican Party has to be able to compete in the places where its heritage and history are, which are in the North and in the West. And if you look at the state of California, and California is interesting because a lot of trends that start in California have a way of coming out across the country. But if you look at the act that occurred where the Republican Party's future in this state, Richard Nixon's state, Ronald Reagan's state, where that future was mortgaged in the 1994 election with Pete Wilson at Proposition 187.
Yep.
Since the founding of the Republican Party in 1854, we've had two political parties in this country. Sometime in late 2016 or early 2017, for the first time since we had a two-party Republican and Democratic system, and going back to 1854, the Republican Party will become a third party in one of the 50 states, and that will be in California, where the Republican Party will be smaller than the decline to state party, which are independents. And so you've seen the collapse of the political party of Abraham Lincoln in the state that produced Ronald Reagan. It is extraordinary.
Okay. I want to jump in here and take one more pass at this, then move to a different topic, which isn't just putting pressure on the Republicans here on the stage.
They can handle it. They can handle it.
I'm sure. You were optimistic about what might happen in the 2014 midterm elections coming up, but the past 15 minutes of conversation has expressed extraordinary pessimism about the future of the Republican Party. And if that was known, that was supposedly the big lesson of the 2012 election. Republicans had to take on immigration, had to put a much friendlier face forward. And if it's a matter of changing from a national party to a southern regional party, if it's becoming a third party in California, why has massive self-interest not produced different strategies in the past 2 years?
Because you have a class and category of candidates that are afraid of their own shadows. And they are afraid of giving offense to talk radio hosts, to the Republican entertainment complex. Look, when Rick Santorum got on the stage at a debate and he started talking about contraception as a national security threat, I've been married for 14 years, and I was thinking about this, is that outside of my marriage, the only other person in this country of 330 million people have any idea how they use contraception is Rick Santorum. But the issue on Rick Santorum sitting there talking about contraception, it was Mitt Romney not looking at him saying, "What are you, nuts?" Exactly. We're the pro-life party. We're not the anti-contraception party. And in fact, more of one gets you less of the other. Right? And the limited government party has no business talking to women about this issue and what they can and what they, and what they should do. So on a range of issues, people are very, very scared of being criticized by one of these talk radio hosts, being criticized by one of the angry bloggers on Twitter. And here's the bottom line. If you're afraid of a talk radio host, I suspect you're going to have a hard time looking eye to eye with Vladimir Putin. and so every day of a presidential campaign is a character test. There's no bad questions of a reporter to ask. There's only bad answers. Right? And because every question is an opportunity to reveal an aspect of your character, your grace, your humility, your courage, your patriotism. And so we'll see as we come up into the next cycle, if we have candidates who are more willing to risk doing what Bill Clinton did in 1992 to take an unelectable Democratic Party, transform it, make it electable. Will we have candidates who go and do that? We may well have a couple who do that, but we'll have to wait and see how the debates play out. But that's what happened in 2012. Bunch of scaredy cats up there.
Yeah.
Let's turn to a different topic now that is meant to involve both parties. So one of the things we passed out as suggested reading was the long-term polling that expresses the public's confidence in the capacity of the U.S. Congress to get work done. And you guys know the data, I'm sure, better than I do, but it's at a near or all-time low. It actually dipped below into the single digits for one of the cycles recently. 9% expressed confidence in the U.S. Congress.
And who are they?
Right, and who are they? As Larry Lessig, who was mentioned earlier, has said, that means that there were almost certainly more people during the Revolutionary War who expressed confidence in the Crown than there are currently who express confidence in the U.S. Congress.
Was he suggesting that as a remedy?
No. And then I want to couple that with a book that came out.
Let's join Scotland.
Right. A book that came out, which I'm guessing many of the people in the audience have read. I'm sure you guys have read Our Town, about the various.
This Town.
This Town. Sorry, not Our Town.
I have
this
not
town.
read it.
Yeah. This Town.
I have not.
Well, it's about the dysfunction of Washington, D.C. I wonder how you think now, not with respect to the midterm election, but as folks who have been longstanding observers and indeed participants in national politics, what this all-time low public approval rating or confidence in the U.S. Congress, combined with the kind of clownish and dysfunctional portrait of Washington, D.C., implies for the health of democracy, and more relevantly, what should be done about it?
Well, I'll take a quick jump at that. I mean, the practical implications of that, when people lose confidence, the response to that is not to engage. And that's why you get low voter participation, because they look at the system and they think it's rigged, and they're right. When somebody can go buy a Senate seat for $2 million and I can only give $100, where's the justice in that? And how does that compel me to participate in democracy when I see Sheldon Adelson giving $100 million, or the Koch brothers, or Tom Steyer?
I knew that.
I think that that's a significant contribution. I'm sorry, what was the question?
Dysfunction, what could be done about it? Well, no labels is, I'm sure, one effort, and you've been working, you said, with Larry Lessig and the Super PAC to end Super PACs, or the candidates who will try to change what you identified as the root cause of the problem, namely the place of money in politics. Are you optimistic about success? Does it deeply distress you, the low approval ratings? At least a couple of you expressed general confidence about America and its capacity to solve problems over the long haul. Does this all-time low approval rating shake that confidence at all?
Well,
why shouldn't it?
I mean, I think I maintain the belief that ultimately democracy does respond to the marketplace, and as I said, as we're seeing at No Labels, increasingly, particularly freshmen, and we got a lot of the freshman class last time. We'll get a lot of the new freshman class because they're out there. They're not part of the hostage to the old system. They're hearing from constituents that they want problem solvers sent to Congress. So when we started this, we had 20 members. Our goal was to get to 50. The leadership patted us on the head and said, if you can get to 70, assuming we never would, come back. And we have 94 now, half Democrats, half Republicans working together. So that's a response, I think, to the marketplace. I mean, without that marketplace response, I think we would have seen the same thing happening. But those are the sort of things that are happening. And Lessig's got his May Day PAC that's working on money in politics. That's a big lift because it's a Supreme Court decision and we can work around the edges on disclosure and a number of kind of legislative mini fixes to it. But it's really going to take either a state constitutional convention or a ratified amendment or a replacement of the Supreme Court to change Citizens United.
I think we forget sometimes that America has always been a very centrist country. And we are also a country that resists strong centralized authority. I mean, we were created by taking on the most powerful force on earth, the King of England. And our framers built a system that was designed to be complex and intricate so that we didn't do things rashly or easily. It really had to be hammered out. Now, you know, maybe a few hundred years later now, we're kind of grappling with some other realities. I mean, I think it's simple. And look, Mark, I'm not sandbagging Mark here. I think No Labels is a good effort. They're getting some really good people in there, but he knows, because I've said this to him and one of his colleagues, they've got some people in there as their partners for progress who have sponsored impeachment resolutions against the president. We have now had 3 successive presidents where a third or more of the population, because they disagree with the president, think he should be impeached. This is something we've only done twice in our history. It shouldn't be casual, and we shouldn't be talking about it. I think that the only way we're going to solve this, I'll be honest with you, is I think, look, I only spend 2 nights, I will never spend more than 2 nights in a row in Washington. I do a lot of work there. I have an apartment there, but I don't want to be in that bubble. That's why I'd never read this town. I know how it works, and I don't want to lose the voice of average people. But unless we have people serving in Congress who care more about doing the right thing than getting reelected, we're not going to do the right thing. The system is stacked in such a way that we think we've reduced incumbent protection, and I think Mark is right about Citizens United. It's protected it. And people have to be willing to take risks if they want to serve and just do the right thing. And I know that sounds a little Pollyannish, but that's what we're missing right now. If John Boehner, in the House of Representatives, he lives by something called the Hastert Rule, which says that they won't put a bill on the floor unless a majority of the Republican caucus in the House wants to pass it. So we have bills. Immigration could probably pass in the House with Democrat and Republican votes if Boehner would stand up to his own members and say, screw that, this is right for the country, I'm putting it on the floor. He won't do it.
Ruth and Mark, you want to?
No, Ruth, respond, and then I'll say something.
Okay, I'm sorry, because I just remember the point that I was going to make earlier when I
You started insulting my brother. You had said something about my brother.
You just respond to your mention of This Town, because it's an important component that we haven't really added to the discussion. The interesting thing about This Town, which is a great book, a really terrific book, is that it certainly points to the hyper-partisanship as a problem, but it says more to the point, the problem in this thesis is that it's transactional. And it goes into just kind of the whole sort of consultant, lobby, sort of hand-greasing that goes on in Washington that really testifies to a big part of the problem as well that we haven't really touched on.
So this is a great segue because, I'm sorry, Steve.
No, go ahead, I'm sorry.
On This Town, and Mark Leibovich, she's a great writer. It's a fun read. Even you could stand it. But actually, I think his whole thesis is about the excessive coziness of Washington. I wrote a column on this, which basically said, Mark has it totally wrong. The problem with Washington isn't that there's too much coziness, is that there's too little coziness. That we used to have situations where Republican senators and Democratic senators had relationships. They had worked on legislation before. They had compromised before. They had passed things before. It turned out to be fun, so they did it all over again. Those kinds of relationships and friendships, the Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedys, don't have opportunities really to blossom and flourish anymore. So my argument is, because I spend many nights in a row in Washington, and I'm sorry, you're probably like nervous even sitting next to me that it might be infectious or something, and so I won't like sneeze in your direction. But I think if we had more habits of coziness in Washington, we'd be better than the habits we have now.
But this is more broad than just low approval numbers in Congress. You've seen a collapse of trust in very nearly every public institution in the country: financial services sector, media, government, political parties. And it's not just in the United States. You see this phenomenon playing out in the UK with the UKIP party, in France with the National Front, in the Netherlands, in Sweden. You see a disconnect between the global elites and regular people in all of these countries who think all of these organizations your big institutions are conspiring in a way, colluding in a way that screws the little guy. And so I think that you're going to see some real populism in some of these races in 2016 with some of the candidates. And I just tell a quick story, if I could, it goes to the point of this. So the country lost one of its great heroes, I think, last year, the Democratic senator from Hawaii, Daniel Inouye. And Daniel Inouye was a young man. He was at a Japanese-American internment camp. And they had the opportunity, the young men in that camp, to join the Army. And he served as part of the all-Japanese-American 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And when he left for war, his father told him, do not dishonor your family's name, and you go and you show that you are as every bit as much an American as any American, and don't come back alive if you do dishonor our family's name. And he was an officer, second lieutenant. He led his men in a charge against a German machine gun nest, grievously wounded. His left arm was shot off. He continued the advance on the pillbox, destroyed it, received the Medal of Honor. Spent years recuperating in a hospital after the war, and he met another young soldier there who was grievously wounded, taught him to play bridge. And they became lifelong friends. And as they were talking in 1947, 1948 or so, he said, what do you want to do after the war? And his friend said to him, he said, well, I'm going to go into politics. I'm going to get elected to Congress. And Inouye he said he hadn't thought much about politics at that point in his life or his career, but he became the first elected member of Congress from the state of Hawaii. And he sent a note to his friend, and he said to his friend, here I am, where are you? Well, when Daniel Inouye's casket was laid out and cordoned off, that friend was wheeled up to the cordons around that casket. And the old man got out of his wheelchair, and he said, Danny wouldn't want to see me in this chair. And Bob Dole saluted with his good hand. These guys were giants. We have a sea of clowns, right, that are there right now. We had the greatest generation, and we have their children who are among the worst generation of political leaders that this country has had. We do have a generation that has come back from war and maybe understands, like that generation did, that we're not each other's enemies. We're each other's political opponents. But ISIS, that's an enemy. A Republican isn't, and a Democratic candidate isn't. So whether it's a Tammy Duckworth from Illinois,
Chris Gibson from New York,
whether it's a Tom Cotton in Arkansas, who people might disagree with, but people who have served and understand something that Ted Cruz never can.
Serve a cause greater than themselves.
And so that's why I'm optimistic. The country's always been resilient on this front. And so we certainly do have a deficit, but I think we also have a generation that will rising, and like generations before, will have to do their duty and to take the torch, as John Kennedy called it, because we have a generation that has largely failed.
Well, that is incredibly well said, Steve, honestly. And you know, one of the things, we'll still have some more time in the discussion, but one of the things I was going to ask you guys to do was to speak to the students and the students in the audience. And I think you spoke to everybody in the audience, Steve, but to the students.
Mark. Yeah, I'd just like to echo a little bit of that, and a little more specifically on what you said, Jim, which is I've had the opportunity over the last few years to have some fellowships at different universities and teach and really engage with millennials and many of your generation. And it's given me great hope and optimism about the possibility for the future, because what I see is a generation of Americans who they're engaged, but they're not naive. They're a bit cynical and skeptical. They're skeptical about the institutions that Steve touched on a little bit. They're skeptical about the Republican Party. They're skeptical about the Democratic Party. They're skeptical about the traditional channels that they've seen break down and work, and they're smart enough to kind of see through the BS. And as a consequence of that, but they, as a group, I think they're also incredibly entrepreneurial, incredibly engaged as citizens. I mean, they really want to be they have a citizen kind of DNA about being involved in the community, being involved in trying to change the course of the future, but just doing it in a different way. And a lot of them are doing it through NGOs, through startups. But Bill Clinton talks a lot about this, and just this notion that government, as for all the reasons we've been talking about tonight, is just failing to function, and therefore other institutions like NGOs, nonprofits, and other organizations are where the energy is now kind of being focused, and I just see a great massive kind of generation taking up the challenge of meeting our goals, but maybe doing it in a non-traditional way.
I want to follow up on that, and I'm especially curious to hear the rest of your opinions on this. So I don't have the experience you just described of teaching at many different universities. I have a bunch of years of experience teaching here with lots of undergraduates, and as everyone now knows, Stanford is the seedbed of Silicon Valley, and the current generation of students here are majoring in computer science or engineering in great numbers and heading entrepreneurially for startups in Silicon Valley with great frequency. At the same time, at least some people within Silicon Valley express even greater amounts of distrust and, in fact, outright rejection of the utility or significance of Washington, D.C. And so you have people say, Washington, D.C. doesn't matter anymore. This is where the future is being made. And I wonder what political hands think about, I don't know if that's a dominant sentiment here, but it's one you can sense here in Silicon Valley. I wonder what you think about a kind of rejection of the significance entirely.
Well, I welcome it because I think that they get it and they understand the need for disruption, and in fact, that's where Lessig's Mayday PAC is getting a lot of our funding is from Silicon Valley, because I think a lot of people in Silicon Valley know we just kind of got to disrupt the system in order to get it back to functioning again.
But I'm going to say I totally disagree, not about whether the system is functioning and whether it should be disrupted, but about the relevance of Washington. Absolutely, the vibrancy and growth of America has to happen in the private market economy. The technological revolution that is centered here is essential to our past growth and our future growth. But without a functional Washington, we really can't have America work properly. We couldn't have America where it is today without Dwight Eisenhower building a national highway system. We need the infrastructure for the 21st century. We need an education system for the 21st century. We need a tax code, maybe even for the 20th century, that is going to that is going to deal with issues that range from corporate profitability and sustainability and the capacity to produce the kind of growth that Steve talked about, to the really fundamental issues of income inequality that face the country, that are exacerbated in many ways by the tax code, and issues of social safety net going forward. So just to say that, to sniff with disdain about Washington, that it's broken may be correct, that it's irrelevant is, I think, irresponsible.
I don't think that was really what you had in the premise of the question. And I think, to your point, I think Silicon Valley is engaging more with Washington on Forward.us, and they're getting involved in immigration, and where they're seeing that Washington is failing to respond, I think they're starting to jump into the fray.
Yeah, but let me ask you guys a question, a follow-up on that, and then make a point which we may not have time to get into, which is I teased Steve a little when I made my intro about Alito and Roberts, but you have to look at the performance of the Supreme Court in the last 15 years as one of the extraordinary problems we've faced. That's a comment from me, that we have had a Supreme Court that has reflected the pathetic partisanship.
Are you a Democrat?
But can I?
I'm a registered independent.
I want to jump in for the bullet, because I know he can't speak for himself.
But the bullet can speak for himself.
Let's not forget that the politicization of approval of Supreme Court nominees began with Democrats attacking Judge Bork, who is eminently qualified. As bad as his politics were, you can look at me, Ruth, but go back and look it up in the history books.
I don't have to look it up in the history books. I covered the nomination.
We attacked him mercilessly because we didn't like his politics,
Correct.
not because he was unqualified.
Okay, I just can't even let that stand. I just need to say 10 seconds about this. Bork was intellectually qualified to be on the Supreme Court. Unless you think that ideology and judicial philosophy is irrelevant for measuring a Supreme Court nominee's qualifications, I believe that the vote to deny him confirmation was the right vote and saved America from an even worse Supreme Court.
Okay, so here's the thing. I'm going to intervene between you and your pal Joel over there. But
And I can't
I am going to
believe that
say
we were
that
having this
my point was
conversation.
not that. And by the way,
Yeah.
I won't go in there. But here's what I'll say. I meant the behavior of the Supreme Court now, not the nomination process. I literally mean the way the Supreme Court in the past 15 years has become so overtly politicized in critical decisions. Whether it was Bush v. Gore, last time we had you here with Lehane, you know, the two opposing guys during the campaign, as Mark, and we had a little reference to it there tonight, Mark, about you had to wait till the Supreme Court 5-4 voted to put. But the real thing is it's the utter politicization of a body that's supposed to be, the third branch of government supposed to be removed from electoral politics. Just a point, not so much the nomination process, just the way they're behaving. I'm
going to call Cheney and have you sent to Guantanamo.
I didn't put him. That's also in his resume that he worked for Cheney. Anyway.
Can I tell? I remember coming through San Francisco with the vice president in the back of the limo, and I said, "Sir," I said, "I think all those polls could be bullshit. All these people had the middle finger up in San Francisco, you know, given as we were coming by. I said, I think all those polls could be BS. Look at all those people waving at you. I said, they love you here."
But my question is, okay. My question, though, is to Rob's question, follow up on Rob's, which is this, the advice you would give to the young people in the audience. Because, Mark, you were talking about NGOs. Look, all of you have done remarkable things with your career. But you all understand politics really well, whether, Ruth, it's in Washington or whether it's in California or Texas or wherever. If you were going to tell young people today, right, some of whom will go off and build the next version of Silicon Valley, who will do remarkable things, but some of them are going to be real leaders on these issues. Would you urge them, like John Gardner did to me, and I have not to this date listened to him yet, that I should run for, that you, at some point you should run for office and get involved? Or would you say, no, there's generalized. Or would you say, no, given the current state of politics, take a look at building a nonprofit or doing kids in education work or human rights work or immigration work? What would be your, you guys have kids, what would you tell your kids, you all do? What would you tell young people today about this?
Can I ask how many students have never been to Washington, D.C.? You should go to Washington, D.C. It's a beautiful city, and and in that city is the story of our country. And you think about the Capitol Dome, which is it's a majestic building. One of the great acts of optimism in the country's history was Lincoln's mandate that the construction be completed in the middle of a terrible civil war, whose outcome was very much in question. His notion that the government of the people, by the people, for the people should endure. And so what I would say to young people today is this, is that an awfully high percentage of this generation is going to live to be over 100 years old. You're going to live to the very edge of the 22nd century. It's remarkable. It's a point more distant in time than we are today from the Battle of Gettysburg than it will be at the end of this century from the D-Day battle. You're going to live in an age of wonder and discovery in science, in medicine, in transportation. The future is bright. And you have great privilege going to one of the most elite universities in the world. And you have great opportunity to make the world better. But like any generation of Americans, and John Kennedy, in one of the great speeches delivered by an American president, his phraseology for this is that the torch was being passed to a new generation. And like all generations, that torch will pass to you. And out of this university, the leaders in science and medicine and political leadership and education, maybe military leadership. There's going to be an abundance of opportunities for service. And what I would say to all of you, and something that Mark spends so much of his time doing, is take the opportunity to serve and to make the country a better place.
Let's give each of you,
please.
Each of you an opportunity to add something if you wish, and then we'll wrap up.
I'll just say that again, I see a huge desire and talent among your generation to change things in a positive direction. I mean, you look at what's happening, for example, in New Orleans. That city's being rebuilt by 20-something and 30-somethings who've just come and completely rebuilt that city. What's happening with the school system, it's amazing what that kind of energy brings. Most of the energy that we see at No Labels comes from our college campuses, and we've got chapters in 100 college campuses, and building rapidly. And the other thing I'll mention too is talk about entrepreneurship. One of the Reform and Money nonprofits that I'm working with is an organization called CounterPAC, which is based here in Silicon Valley, and it's from a guy who used to go to the University of Texas, came out here, started a gaming company, sold it, made a pretty good amount of money. But he was into game theory, and he loved politics, and he wanted to change things. And so he's come up with some private sector solutions to problems of money and politics that because of failure of legislation or regulation to address, he's figured out a way to do it through the private sector. Go to counterpac.org. It's very interesting what he's done. But those are the kind of things. When I'm talking about smart young people figuring out new and different ways to address the problems through different channels.
So I just say really quickly, if you want to be entrepreneurial, be entrepreneurial. If you want to work for an NGO, work for an NGO. But don't give up on Washington. Don't give up on government. It's still the most direct way to effect change, as difficult as it is. And please come visit us, join us, stay for more than 2 nights.
Joel.
Look, I agree with everything my friends here have said, and we are friends, and we have these conversations all the time, and it's been one of the great pleasures of the last 6 or 7 years for me, getting to know Steve especially. I've known Ruth for about 7 years now, Mark a little less, but...
A little less than 7, it just feels like 7.
It feels like 7, yeah. It may be 7,
Yeah,
2007, right? But, the fact is we can do this, non-ideological conversation, putting the country first and disagree, but, we can find points of agreement, and I don't think any of us ever doubt that the other isn't completely devoted to what's right for this country. I think if you're out there, what I tell kids all the time is, and I talk to colleges, I had a very nonlinear path. I was a journalist before I got into politics, but I started that when I was 30. So for the last 62 years, I say I've had a great career, but I've done 2 different things. I would always encourage people who are in college, find your passion points along the way and connect the dots. Don't go and listen to I'm sorry, parents. Don't listen to your parents who tell you you've got to be directed, you've got to come out of college and know what you want to do. Just, map the path from A to B, and if you go above the line, below the line, as long as you're moving on that continuum, keep going towards your point B, and wherever that takes you, it will. On the subject of politics, I agree with Ruth, and I can seem cynical now. I'm worn down a bit by this. It's been 7 years, and the campaigns get longer. But I have felt that there is a role to play for every citizen in this country. We have an obligation, no matter what we do, to be an active citizenry. Do not turn your back or turn a deaf ear to politics. It is what will make this country great in the end. If we solve the problems we have today, we will lead the world in the 21st century. And if there's a part of you that says you want to play a role in that for a year, for 2 years, go on a campaign or do it as a career, you should do it. Don't walk away from it, because it's an incredibly exhilarating experience. You will never regret it, whether you've done it once or you do it for the rest of your life. Do something political. Be engaged at that level.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.